Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is getting injected in the face with botulinum toxin, one of the most lethal biological substances known to science, because it temporarily paralyzes the muscles that cause wrinkles. And we call this a beauty treatment. We call it routine, normal, self-care. And look, I am not here to judge that. I genuinely am not. Because what I am about to show you is that the impulse to alter, restrict, poison, and reshape the human body in pursuit of a beauty standard is not a modern vanity. It is not the product of Instagram or Hollywood or the fashion industry. It is ancient. It is global. It is consistent across every civilization humans have ever built. And the pattern underneath all of it, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because in almost every case across thousands of years of human history, the people setting the beauty standards and the people physically suffering to meet them were not the same people. Ancient Rome, China, Elizabethan England, Victorian Europe, the Aztecs. We are going everywhere today. And by the end of this video, you will understand that beauty torture is not a chapter in women's history. It is practically the whole book. Let us start in ancient Rome, because Rome, as usual, gives us something that sounds insane until you realize we basically kept doing it for the next 2,000 years. The Roman beauty ideal was pale skin, smooth, white, luminous. The solution was white lead. Ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, was applied directly to the face as foundation every day by wealthy Roman women who wanted to look beautiful and by the men who performed on stage and needed to project their features to the back row. White lead is extraordinarily toxic. It accumulates in the body over time. It causes hair loss, skin damage, neurological symptoms, and eventually death. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. It worked beautifully as a cosmetic. It went on smoothly. It covered everything. It gave the skin a perfect, even, luminous white tone. So women kept using it. The Romans used it, then the Elizabethans used it, then the Victorians used it. White lead face paint appears in beauty literature across Europe from roughly 400 BCE to the late 1800s. That is approximately 2,300 years of women slowly poisoning themselves for the same aesthetic. Queen Elizabeth I of England is one of the most documented cases. She wore ceruse so heavily, in such thick layers, that portraits of her show a face that appears almost mask-like. The lead damaged her skin. She applied more ceruse to cover the damage. The additional ceruse caused more damage. She applied more ceruse. The treatment was indistinguishable from the disease. Historians believe the lead poisoning contributed to her hair loss, which is why she wore wigs. They believe it contributed to her increasingly erratic behavior in her later years. She died in 1603, having worn white lead paint on her face for approximately 40 years, and the formula she was using was fundamentally the same one Roman women had used 16 centuries earlier. Chinese foot binding began approximately in the 10th century CE during the Song Dynasty. By the time it ended, it had been practiced for roughly 1,000 years and had been performed on an estimated 1 billion women. 1 billion. The procedure began when a girl was between 4 and 7 years old, before the bones had fully hardened. The toes were folded under the foot, breaking them. The foot was then bound tightly in wet bandages that contracted as they dried. As the foot grew, the binding forced it into an increasingly compressed shape. The target was a foot of approximately 3 inches. It was called the Golden Lotus. The process was irreversible. The bones that broke and healed in compressed positions could not be unbroken. Women who had their feet bound walked with significant difficulty for the rest of their lives, with a gait that has been described as a perpetual controlled fall. They experienced chronic pain. Infections were common, because the folded toes trapped dirt and moisture. Gangrene was not uncommon. Some women died of complications. And foot binding was, for most of its history, considered deeply attractive. It was a marker of refinement, of status, of femininity. A woman with unbound feet was considered rural, lower class, unsophisticated. Here is the class dimension that runs through this history like a thread. Poor women, women who worked in fields, women who needed to physically labor, often could not have their feet bound, or had them bound less severely, because a woman who cannot walk cannot harvest crops. The more severely bound the foot, the wealthier the family was assumed to be. A woman with 3-inch feet was displaying with her own body the fact that her family could afford to have a daughter who couldn't work. Foot binding was not just a beauty standard, it was a class signal, worn on the body permanently. The European corset has a complicated history that the fashion world has spent decades trying to rehabilitate, and I understand the impulse, but we are going to look at the medical evidence. Corsets as structured undergarments appear in European fashion from roughly the 16th century onward. In their moderate form, they provided support and shaped the silhouette. Fine, functional, complicated but defensible. Then came the Victorian wasp waist. The fashionable Victorian silhouette required a waist of approximately 18 to 20 inches. The average adult female waist is 27 to 28 inches. To achieve this, the corset had to compress the torso by approximately 8 to 10 inches. Your organs do not disappear when this happens. They move. Victorian physicians documented the internal consequences extensively because they were seeing them in their consulting rooms. The liver, which sits just below the right side of the rib cage, was deformed by tight lacing to the point where Victorian women developed what physicians specifically called corset liver, a condition where the organ showed a permanent indentation from years of compression. The stomach and intestines were displaced downward. The lower ribs in women who corseted heavily from childhood were permanently deformed inward. Breathing was restricted to the upper chest only, because the lower chest could not expand. Women fainted regularly, so regularly that fainting couches became a standard piece of furniture in Victorian homes and public spaces. We have attributed this to Victorian women being delicate, fragile, constitutionally prone to swooning. They were being structurally prevented from breathing. And through all of this, physicians, who were almost exclusively male, debated among themselves whether tight lacing was actually harmful. Some argued it was. Others argued the female body was simply naturally suited to compression. It is not. No body is naturally suited to compression. This should not have required debate. While we're in the Victorian era, let us discuss the beauty options that did not involve organ displacement. Arsenic wafers were commercially sold tablets containing arsenic that women took orally to achieve pale, translucent skin. The brand Fowler's Solution was a popular arsenic-based tonic available in pharmacies. It did produce a temporary paleness. It also accumulated in the body, caused peripheral nerve damage, affected the liver and kidneys, and in sufficient doses caused death. And belladonna, which translates from Italian as beautiful woman, was used as eye drops. Diluted extracts of the belladonna plant were dropped directly into the eyes to dilate the pupils, which was considered attractive. Dilated pupils in low light are a physiological sign of attraction, and the Victorians had correctly identified this. The side effects of regular belladonna use include blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and, with prolonged use, permanent damage to the eyes. Several Victorian beauty guides recommended it, with noting as an almost incidental detail that it could cause temporary blindness. Temporary blindness, listed as a minor inconvenience in a beauty guide. There was also lead acetate in hair dye, mercury in skin lightening creams, radioactive thorium in facial creams that were marketed in the early 20th century, after the discovery of radiation, but before anyone fully understood what it did to human tissue. The 20th century beauty industry also gave us radium face cream. You could buy it in department stores. A face cream containing radium, sold in department stores. To be clear, you absorbed it through your skin. That's not how you want to interact with radium. Here is what every single thing in this video has in common. The lead paint used in Rome and Elizabethan England, the bound feet of Song Dynasty China, the compressed organs of Victorian corsetry, the arsenic wafers and the belladonna drops, and the radium face cream. In every case, the standard was set by people who did not have to meet it. Roman men writing about what constituted a beautiful woman were not wearing white lead paint. Chinese men of the Song Dynasty were not binding their own feet. Victorian men published detailed opinions on the ideal female waist measurement in periodicals while wearing clothing that placed no structural restriction on their own bodies whatsoever. In every case, the physical cost was paid by the people who needed to be considered beautiful in order to be considered marriageable, employable, socially viable, fully human. In every case, the cost fell heaviest on the people with the least power to refuse. Poor women could not always access the most dangerous options, which protected them from some harm, but they also could not always access the most socially accepted appearance, which cost them in different ways. In every case, the women who raised concerns, who pointed at the damage, who documented what was actually happening to the bodies of the women around them, were largely ignored, because the men with the medical authority found the aesthetic outcomes more interesting than the physiological consequences.
We have museums full of the fashion. The corsets are in glass cases. The tiny shoes are displayed as art objects. They are genuinely beautiful in some cases. The women who wore them are mostly unnamed. We know what the shoe looked like, we rarely know who walked in it. And the next time someone describes any of this as women simply doing what was fashionable, what was normal, what was their choice, you can point them at the physician's reports, at the deformed livers, at the broken bones that healed wrong, at the arsenic that accumulated slowly in the body over years, and ask them whose choice it really was, and whose body paid for it. And perhaps the strangest part of this entire story is that every civilization believed its beauty standards were normal. The Romans thought lead paint was normal. Victorian Europe thought organ compression was normal. China thought broken feet were beautiful. None of them believed they were living through an era of beauty torture. They believed they were living through an era of beauty. History has a habit of revealing the costs long after the trend itself disappears. The lead poisoning, the damaged bones, the deformed organs, the blindness, the scars. Those are easy for us to see now because we are standing centuries away from them. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If ancient societies couldn't see the hidden costs of their own beauty standards while living through them, what hidden costs are we failing to see today? Because if history teaches us anything, it is this. The most powerful beauty standards are rarely the ones people question. They're the ones everyone accepts as normal. And those are usually the hardest to recognize until they're already history. If you enjoyed exploring these strange corners of history with me, consider subscribing. Every week we uncover forgotten stories, bizarre human behaviors, and the surprising ways the past still shapes the world around us. And if this video made you rethink beauty even for a moment, leave a like. It helps more curious people find the channel. Until next time, stay curious.